Over the next few slides, I'll be showing you a series of images comparing two men. Take a moment and see if you can spot the difference between them. What's the difference between these two men? What about these two? And these? And these men? The previous images were of a Hutu and Tutsi man, a Serb and a Croat, an Armenian and a Turk, and finally, a Nazi and a Jew. Historically, these ethnic groups, or in the last case, religious and political, form their sense of legitimacy along ethnic lines. To outsiders like us, there often seems to be little to no meaningful difference between these groups. Yet, anyone familiar with just a bit of history knows how fiercely each group works to distinguish itself from the other, often by emphasizing the superficial or external traits that are visible to each other. Why are humans so quick to divide ourselves, even when there is so little that truly separates us? In today's video, I'll explore how biology encourages an us versus them mentality, and why culture at its core is evil.
Nobody knows how deep my love for you really goes. But boy, I want you to know I wouldn't ask you to hold back the door.
Culture is one of those evolutionary milestones that allowed our species to transcend biology itself. It is truly difficult to overstate the role of culture and social pair-to-pair bonding in the evolution of humanity, and why we've been able to progress so fast in only recent time. Prior to the development of culture, the only way to meaningfully change a given species was through natural selection. In other words, you were completely at the whim of biology and your physical surroundings in order to change. This resulted in very slow and methodical change, since natural selection required two things: a lot of offspring and a lot of time, both of which prevented any meaningful rapid change. What culture did was it allowed the transfer of information to spread more like wildfire, in a way acting as a sort of proto-city, a proto-language, and even a proto-government, before all of these things existed in the evolution of humanity. It is the precursor to everything attached to human interaction. When biology hit a ceiling, what culture did was break it. Once cultural learning emerged, it outpaced biological evolution as the main survival mechanism. And this is part of the reason why only in about the last 10,000 years we've been able to develop so largely and vastly, and we've really been able to control the entire Earth and its resources. This is because it's only about 10,000 years ago that major cities and centers for learning and structured language started popping up. We have places in Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley civilization, Egypt and such, which developed their own major cities, which naturally leads to more innovation, since we have more people, more ideas circulating in a given system, that being the city. And so more innovation sprouts from that. Culture is a collective memory. No single human can know all edible plants, master all tools, predict social consequences. Alone, no individual is capable of that. What culture acts as is it's a shared database of what worked before, a compression algorithm for experience, and a way to avoid relearning fatal mistakes. This is why rituals, myths, and taboos often encode practical knowledge disguised as meaning. So, when did behavior stop being purely instinctual? If you had to ask what was the one innovation that led to the most significant development of human brain neoteny, that innovation would almost always be fire. Anthropologists believe humans first learned to harness fire even before we were actually humans. To find the first case of fire manipulation, you would have to travel about 1 to 1.5 million years ago, where the earliest controlled use of fire by Homo erectus is believed to have happened. Now, this didn't start to become habitual until about 500,000 years ago, where hearth-shaped structures and dietary changes consistent with fire use and cooking point to the habitual use of controlled fire. Now keep in mind, this is well before Homo sapiens are believed to have existed, which we didn't begin to pop up on the timeline until about 300,000 years ago. This is all to say that this was the biggest turning point that led to our complex social structures. Humans needed to huddle around fires out of necessity. So during this great animalistic leap, from about 115,000 years ago to 11,700 years ago, this was the last glacial period. It's part of the Quaternary Ice Age, where ice sheets covered much of North America, Northern Europe, and parts of Asia. Sea levels were 120 meters lower. This caused the exposing of several land bridges, and most significantly the Beringia land bridge, which actually allowed humans to travel from Asia into the Americas. And average global temperatures were about 6 to 8 degrees colder than they are today. So clearly there was a necessity for heating. This is why, it's not too out of the realm of possibility to imagine a tribe of 10 to 15 ancient humans huddling around a fire close to each other to form tight, close communal bonds that would evolve into what in retrospect would be considered a proto-culture. Even before the onset of language, even before, the onset of all these complex structures, it's not too hard to believe that, because these people were forced so close to each other, they became better at reading faces. Pair-to-pair bonding became much more significant as, you needed the trust of your tribe or your pack in order to have access to this fire. The worst thing would be to be exiled because you would have nowhere to heat up. You'd have no food. You relied on your community. This is most evidenced by the spike in symbolic culture and art really flourishing during this time period. So things like cave paintings, figurines, these things were staples of this era about 115,000 years ago. So what's with all of this context? Does this have to do with culture being evil? So although culture served incredible significance during that initial leap from animalistic instinctual behavior to complex social structures, now that those structures exist, those initial tribalistic and cultural roots have essentially been rendered obsolete and in fact hold humanity back from unified development. This is why in the modern day, ideals such as democracy and unified freedom seem to stand in contradiction with cultural ingrouping, and why in this next section I will explore exactly how culture has outlived its biological lifespan. Now that we have the scientific background and general consensus about how and why culture developed out of the way, I will begin to formulate why I believe that has outlived its biological lifespan. Alright, so culture at its core is the apex of conflict. Right? It's defensive and inherently against external influence. We see expressions of culture and our first instinct is often admiration for the differences in human society. But if you really think critically about what a separate culture even existing implies, you'll quickly find that, it necessitates conflict. It is inherently rooted in the idea that we as a group have alienated ourselves so far from our neighboring factions that we have developed our own linguistic schematism, our own food, clothes, norms, religions that we've decided to follow completely insulated from outside influence. Right? And this over time inherently disincentivizes outside opinion. Right? Why cultural and societal influence in these small pockets of factions are so dangerous is it promotes an us versus them by virtue of it being defined as a societal schematism. This is why it is seen as a sort of symbol of pride to plant your flag on, say, undiscovered land like the moon, right? And this is why outside opinions from, say, a different culture isn't taken as seriously as ones that originated internally from an already established culture and society. And this is no better exemplified than by seeing the overall trajectory of human social development. So originally, culture functioned as an evolutionary advantage that allowed early humans, to escape purely animalistic survival. So this was established earlier: shared customs, language, traditions. These things helped early societies determine who could be trusted in a group and who followed the same rules. So in small, tightly knit communities, this worked perfectly.
For example, early tribal societies relied on religion and storytelling to enforce cooperation and discourage internal violence. Without these shared cultural markers, large-scale coordination would have been impossible, and early social organization would not have emerged. Modern states, however, operate under entirely different conditions. Countries today consist of millions of strangers governed by abstract institutions such as courts, laws, and bureaucracies. These systems are designed to function independently of ethnic or cultural identity, relying instead on universal rules and equal citizenship. Yet human psychology has appeared to not yet move past this initial bias. People still instinctively place greater trust in those who appear culturally similar, even when institutions are meant to render such distinctions irrelevant. Don Byrne, a social psychologist, formalized this tendency in his similarity attraction theory, which concluded that people are drawn to those sharing similar attitudes, values, interests, and demographics, which in essence supports the idea that people are more biased in favor of their own culture. This creates tension between modern governance and ancient social instincts. Democracy is particularly sensitive to this tension because it depends on generalized trust. Citizens must believe that political opponents are legitimate, that institutions are neutral, and that losing an election does not mean exclusion from society. In countries like Japan or South Korea, historically more culturally homogeneous, democratic systems have benefited from a shared national identity. That reduces the risk of politics becoming an us versus them struggle. Political disagreements exist, but they tend to remain focused on policy rather than identity, making compromise possible. By contrast, in societies where cultural or ethnic divisions strongly overlap with political power, democracy often becomes unstable. Liberia in the late 20th century is a stark example. Under leaders like Samuel Doe and later Charles Taylor, political power was concentrated in the hands of particular ethnic groups, while much of the indigenous population was systematically excluded from meaningful participation in elections and governance. State authority was used to maintain the dominance of the ruling elite, which turned democracy into a mechanism that reinforced existing social hierarchies rather than providing equal representation. Similarly, in the former Yugoslavia, democratic processes collapsed as Serbs, Croats, and Bosniaks increasingly viewed the state as an instrument of rival ethnic groups rather than a neutral civic institution. In these cases, political loss was interpreted not as a temporary setback, but as a threat to the legitimacy and survival of one's own people. Even in modern democratic states, similar dynamics can be observed on a smaller scale. When political parties align strongly with ethnic, religious, or cultural identities, trust in institutions declines. Voters believe courts, police, or elections favor other groups, leading to reduced compliance with laws and rejection of democratic outcomes. This is not because diversity itself is harmful, but because unresolved cultural segmentation makes it difficult to sustain a shared sense of political belonging. Now, the United States, in this dynamic, is increasingly visible in its polarization of political parties. Along cultural and identity lines, over the past few decades, both major parties have increasingly appealed to voters along these cultural markers: race, religion, region. Markers of identity have become the main ploy of political candidates rather than solely policy. As a result, election outcomes are often perceived not merely as a political setback, but as a symbolic loss for one's cultural or social group. Studies in political psychology and voting behavior show that individuals are more likely to interpret electoral defeat as a threat to their group status and legitimacy, which, as we've seen, has eroded trust in institutions, deepened partisan divisions, and reduced the fairness of courts, law enforcement, and electoral processes. Even in stable democracies, cultural segmentation can transform political contests into zero-sum struggles over collective identity rather than policy differences. While culture once enabled humanity's rise from animal survival to organized society, its continued use as a political sorting mechanism in modern states undermines democracy, weakens institutional trust, and obstructs unified human development. This phenomena is not unique to political systems. Economic theories are also subject to cultural tribalism. In the Western world, young adults tend to be dissatisfied with capitalism, with many believing it has fallen short of its promises. This dissatisfaction is not without probable cause, as the income gap between classes, at least in the United States, has increasingly become almost insurmountable. However, the source of this inequality is more fundamental than capitalism itself. At its core, capitalism is meant to reward labor and innovation. When functioning ideally, it is supposed to be meritocratic. Yet when it's applied to societies already fractured into competing identity groups, capitalism tends to intensify those divisions. It is no coincidence, therefore, that among capitalist countries, the more culturally homogeneous ones tend to exhibit lower levels of income inequality. Capitalism is not to blame for this economic inequality. It only appears to fail because it is applied to a fundamentally tribal species. Capitalism assumes everyone starts from the same playing field. It assumes the existence of an individual, someone capable of self-interest, abstraction, responsibility, and meaning-making. Humans, however, have evolved as group-bonded organisms, viewing our own identity as superior to others. Our psychology was built for tribes, not competing markets. Because of this, economic systems cannot supply what tribes once did. They offer no inherent identity, no sense of belonging, and no moral certainty. Their purpose is coordination, not meaning. Economic theory therefore feels hollow to the Western man because it leaves unanswered questions, the questions humans instinctively ask. Who am I? Where do I belong? What gives my life meaning? Capitalism quietly presumes these questions have already been resolved elsewhere. The perceived failure here, then, is not economic but existential. It emerges when a system designed to allocate resources is burdened with the task of supplying purpose. Until individuals are capable of grounding identity and meaning within themselves rather than deriving them from group allegiance, any system built on individual autonomy will continue to feel insufficient. Not because it is unjust, but because it was never meant to replace the tribe. What is an individual? That question is remarkably modern. Initially, there really was no concept of an individual. There was simply society, your family, your clan, your tribe, You, as a person, as an individual, simply did not exist. The concept of individualism really didn't pop up in the English lexicon until it was coined by philosopher and former Minister for Europe and French Foreign Affairs Alexis de Tocqueville, who upon visiting the United States on a diplomatic mission in 1831 was so appalled at Americans' tribal selfishness and lack of regard for one's neighbor that in 1835, his book Democracy in America, he coined a word meant to encapsulate what it was like to live as a Western man. In the French, individualisme. In the English, individualism. Humans are naturally inclined towards nationalism, and more broadly, in-group loyalty. Because our psychology was shaped in an environment where group survival preceded individual identity, for most of human history, the individual did not exist as a meaningful unit. Survival, purpose, and value were all mediated through the tribe. To be cast out was effectively a death sentence. As a result, evolution favored minds that fused identity with group membership, rewarding conformity and treated threats to ideas, to the group, as existential threats to the self. Nationalism, therefore, is not an accident or a modern political invention. It is a scaled-up version of early tribalism, repackaged for large impersonal societies drawn up with abstract states. When traditional tribes dissolved and populations grew too large for face-to-face bonds, abstract symbols such as nations, flags, religion, ideology replaced kinship as the glue that held people together. These symbols provided identity, belonging, meaning, and moral certainty for the modern man. This also explains why people often defend identities they did not choose. The brain treats inherited group markers like nationality, religion, and ethnicity as extensions of the self. So again, the criticism of the group feels like a personal attack. Schopenhauer observed a similar phenomenon. He writes, "Every miserable fool who has nothing at all of which he can be proud adopts a last resource pride in the nation to which he belongs. He is ready and happy to defend all its faults and follies tooth and nail, thus reimbursing himself for his own inferiority." And further, another quote often attributed to him, although it's not confirmed it's from him, follows saying, 5 minutes after you are born, they will decide your name, nationality, religion, and sect, and you will spend the rest of your life defending things you did not choose. In short, humans gravitate towards nationalism because our minds were built for tribes, not individuals. Modern societies may talk about personal autonomy and may front abstract economic theories and political institutions like capitalism and democracy, but beneath that layer runs ancient software that seeks safety, purpose, and dignity through collective identity. Until individuals can reliably generate meaning independent of group allegiance, nationalism and similar forms of in-group loyalty will remain powerful because they satisfy needs that predate the idea of self itself. If we are so ingrained as cultural and tribal species, why then does individual genius receive such disproportionate recognition in human societies? And why do humans so often produce their most transformative innovations in isolation rather than through collective effort? From a biological perspective, this pattern appears paradoxical. In many species, especially eusocial organisms such as ants, termites, and bees, group-based problem-solving vastly outperforms individual effort. Ant colonies operate as superorganisms. Individuals follow simple, genetically encoded behavioral rules, yet collectively achieve remarkable feats of engineering, resource allocation, and environmental adaptation. Leafcutter ants cultivate fungal agriculture, fire ants form buoyant rafts during floods, and honeybees perform collective decision-making through quorum sensing. These systems are empirically efficient because individual variation is minimized and deviation is selected against biologically. The effectiveness of these systems depends on several biological conditions: high genetic homogeneity, rigid raw specialization, and environments that reward optimization rather than novelty. In eusocial species, innovation at the individual level is unnecessary and often harmful. Natural selection favors conformity because success depends on executing established strategies with maximal efficiency. Experimental studies of ant colonies show that individuals that deviate from task allocation reduce overall colony performance, reinforcing the evolutionary pressure against individuality. Humans diverged sharply from this model as cultural complexity increased. Unlike eusocial insects, humans rely on culture rather than genetics to coordinate large-scale cooperation. Language, norms, moral systems, and symbolic meaning allowed humans to form societies orders of magnitude larger than kin-based groups. However, cultural transmission introduces variability and cognitive flexibility that biology alone does not constrain. This flexibility enables abstract reasoning and imagination, but it also creates tension between conformity and innovation. Social psychology and anthropology consistently show that cultural and religious groups strongly enforce norms through punishment, ostracism, and reputational control, mechanisms that stabilize cooperation but suppress deviation. Phenomena such as groupthink, conformity bias, and preference falsification illustrate how social pressure narrows the range of acceptable ideas, even when those ideas are clearly incorrect. This tendency was famously demonstrated by the social psychologist Solomon Asch in a series of experiments on nonconformity. In these experiments, individuals were asked to make simple perceptual judgments, yet many abandoned their own accurate perceptions in order to align with an obviously false group consensus. What made Asch's findings especially revealing was that conformity did not stem from confusion or lack of information, but from social cost. Participants often knew the group was wrong and still chose agreement over isolation. The experiments exposed how fear of standing alone can outweigh the evidence of one's own senses. When extended beyond the laboratory, this dynamic helps explain how false beliefs persist within societies, not because they are convincing, but because individuality carries psychological and social penalties. Innovation, by definition, requires violation of existing cognitive and social constraints. From a neuroscientific perspective, creative insight correlates strongly with reduced brain activity in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the region of the brain associated with social monitoring and norm enforcement. This suggests that the suppression of social self-regulation, temporarily disengaging from concern over group evaluation, is a prerequisite for original thought. Acting alone removes immediate social penalties and allows individuals to explore hypotheses that would otherwise be dismissed as irrational, immoral, or absurd. Isaac Newton produced his most significant work during periods of intense isolation, notably during the plague years when he developed the foundations of classical mechanics, optics, and calculus. These breakthroughs did not emerge from collaborative refinement, but from radical abstraction. He unified terrestrial and celestial motion under a single mathematical law. This unification required rejecting entrenched Aristotelian frameworks of that time, something that could not have emerged within a consensus-driven intellectual environment. Newton's behavior also aligns with known psychological traits associated with high-impact innovation: obsessive focus, low conformity, and antagonistic independence. His public disputes with Robert Hooke and Leibniz demonstrate his inclination towards nonconformity. From a sociological standpoint, Newton derived legitimacy internally rather than socially, insulating his reason from external correction at the cost of a social life. This same pattern appears in other domains of thought. Newton's rejection of Trinitarian theology, despite severe social consequences, illustrates a consistent willingness to violate deeply embedded cultural norms when they conflicted with his reasoning. From an evolutionary standpoint, humans occupy a unique niche. Groups optimize for survival, stability, and efficiency, while individuals generate variation. Cultural evolution, much like biological evolution, depends on both selection and mutation. Groups perform selection by preserving norms that maintain cohesion, while individuals produce mutations by violating those norms. Innovation, by its nature, is a form of norm violation. Its primary driver is not efficiency, but taboo, the willingness to think, say, and believe what the group considers wrong. As culture becomes more dominant, the cost of deviation rises. Acting as an independent thinker in a highly culturalized society means pushing against a social psyche that has evolved to suppress deviation in the name of cohesion. When conformity is rewarded and dissent is moralized, the very mechanism that generates progress is constrained. This helps us explain why radical intellectual advances so often emerge from periods of intense isolation rather than consensus. Groups excel at refining ideas within an accepted framework, but individuals are uniquely capable of abandoning those frameworks altogether. When culture overpowers the individual, human development doesn't accelerate. It stagnates, repeating inherited patterns rather than generating new ones. Unlike ants, whose success depends on eliminating individuality, human progress depends on selectively protecting it. The individual thinker, operating outside of social reinforcement, becomes the primary mechanism through which humanity escapes cognitive and cultural equilibrium. This is why major waves of human innovation coincided with Enlightenment thought. Rationalism functioned as an anti-culture, privileging the individual mind over inherited authority. By the 16th century, a turning point had emerged. The individual began to supersede the tribe as the primary engine of progress. Immanuel Kant fits the same archetype. Where Newton divinated nature, Kant divinated the mind. He worked almost entirely alone, obsessively, methodically, and in near total isolation from intellectual, fashion, or political movements of his time. His life was rigidly structured to the point of legend, and like Newton, Kant understood that truth does not emerge from consensus, but from confrontation with limits. Immanuel Kant's philosophy identifies autonomy as the necessary condition for human progress. For Kant, reason advances only when individuals think for themselves rather than defer to authority, tradition, or collective belief. Kant's critical project was designed to sever knowledge from inherited frameworks. He rejected both rationalist dogma and empirical convention, not by compromise, but by exposing their shared assumption that truth is grounded outside the subject. Kant argued that instead, knowledge depends on the active structure of the mind. This move eliminates appeal to tradition, consensus, or authority as sources of validity. What matters is not whether a belief is shared, but whether it is rationally justified. In Kantian terms, consensus has no epistemic weight. Kant makes this explicit in What is Enlightenment? Enlightenment is man's emergence from self-imposed immaturity, where immaturity is the inability to use one's own understanding without guidance from another. Culture perpetuates immaturity by offering ready-made answers, identities, and moral frameworks. Innovation becomes impossible when individuals outsource thinking to the group. The implication here is profound. Societies do not stagnate because they lack intelligence or creativity. They stagnate because they overproduce culture. When shared meanings harden into unquestioned norms, reason loses its autonomy. If a society wishes to advance, it must reduce the authority of culture and weaken tribal allegiance in favor of individual rational agency. Completely detached from culture and traditional beauty standards, This is the ideal Western man. 5'2", isolated, obsessive, and hideous.